computer. Right, so welcome back, everyone. Today's first talk is going to be joint work by Nick Radcliffe and Shan, who are at University of Edinburgh and the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, putting together some very interesting data sets and trying to make financial data a little bit more readily available. So thanks very much, Nick. Looking forward to the talk.
Thanks, Rohan. Thanks for organizing it. Good morning, good afternoon, good middle of the night to people, depending on where you are. Yes, as Rohan says, I'm Nick Radcliffe. I'll be presenting the talk, but Shan, who's also on the call, my co-author, has certainly done a lot of the actual work on reproducing results that we're talking about here, and others in the team have done work as well. So I'll tell you a bit about GovCo and about our approach to all this stuff. I have to start with the usual disclaimer. The safe haven's all about being very safe. So if you think you spot any errors or omissions in this talk, you're not actually spotting an error at all. You're just seeing strategies that we're using to preserve confidentiality of information, and that includes typos and thinkers and all sorts of things. So I'll tell you a bit about the safe haven in a minute, but in terms of the sort of subject of the workshop, I guess, and from what I saw yesterday on the talks I managed to catch, a lot of the people here are coming from the kind of statistics end of things, the academic end, probably quite used to reproducible research and the idea of publishing code and data and so forth, and maybe even doing replication studies. I guess I come from the slightly less reputable end of things, more kind of Python and machine learning and artificial intelligence rather than statistics, and running code teams and doing testing of software. And the way that I think about QA comes very much from that end of things more than reproducible research per se. But I think both things come together in an interesting way when you look at this area. And my assumption with all of this is that ultimately what all of us are really most interested in is getting the right answers at the end of the day. And so I think there are a number of different approaches that can help to that, and some challenges that we have in the safe haven environment that I'll talk about. And I guess I'm not sure how true this is, but my impression at least is that the sort of R and academic end of things tends to think in terms of reproducible research a lot, whereas the sort of Python end, where maybe more of the data engineering and more of the hackers come from, maybe are more used to the idea of code testing, and some of these like the test-driven data analysis approach that I'll be talking about a bit. But there's definitely overlap across the spectrum. I think they can inform and help each other quite a lot. So I suppose I wanted to start by just making a distinction between reproducible research as I understand it, which most of the talks I see and papers I read about reproducible research are about the practices of publishing code and publishing data and making it all comprehensible and having the opportunity for other people to reproduce those results, as opposed to the subtly different is that not working? The subtly different area of actually reproducing results, actually taking the opportunity to do that and produce the same results. And I suppose it puts me slightly in mind of the old philosophical saw about, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear, does it make a sound? So what I'm going to be talking about is what we've done to actually reproduce research in the context of a safe haven where we can't publish our data. Now, there's a related concept in open source, which is often known as Linus's Law. It was stated by Paul Raymond in the Cathedral and the Bazaar as, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, which is slightly cryptic. But I think what it's supposed to mean is that if you have open source software, then lots of people will look at it and it'll be very hard for bugs to find, and they won't survive very long, and there won't be serious problems in the code. And I think we've now had Linux long enough to realize that this isn't actually true. It's just a claim. And there are plenty of bugs that have sat around in open source software with loads of pairs of eyes actually looking at them for years and years and years. So it's not enough, in my view, just to publish. You actually have to do the work of checking stuff. I think my ability to move forward is being interfered with by people coming into the stream, but I guess that's a good thing. So the way that I've thought about this has really come very much from the software testing end of things, and I think the most important thing that's happened in the last 30 years in software is the development of what's called test-driven development, which is kind of the center of all the agile methodologies. And the idea with test-driven development is relatively radical. It's that before you write any code to do anything, you first write a set of tests that specify how that code should behave. And so literally, if you were writing a function to implement addition, you would write tests that say things like, well, 2 plus 2 should equal 4, and -1 plus 1 should equal 0, and 10 to the 100 plus 10 to the 100 should equal 2 times 10 to the 100, and all that kind of thing. And the idea is that you write enough tests that they act as a kind of specification for what you're doing. And there are frameworks around, the so-called XUnit frameworks, that allow you to run those tests before you've written a single line of production code, and they will fail with errors because you haven't got any code yet. And then the idea is that you write the code to make the tests pass, and that process of making the tests pass usually involves both writing and implementing the code and also correcting the tests, because being humans, we tend to get the tests wrong as well. But the two kind of iterate together until you eventually have working code that pass all the tests. And the idea is that you then stop. And the reason you stop is that the tests really have acted as a functional specification, and there's nothing left to do because you've made all the tests pass. And if there was something else that you should have made the code do, you should have written tests that specify that. Now I say stop in the sense of stop developing the code, but very importantly, you then go through a refactoring phase where you simplify the code, because almost always our first pass at code is ugly and has lots of dead ends and is suboptimal in all sorts of ways. And one of the great things about having a body of tests that show that it's working is you can safely manipulate the code and refactor it and simplify it, secure in the knowledge that you won't break anything without some tests failing if you've done a good job. And the idea is then that if you want to add functionality or fix bugs, you do the same thing. The first thing you do if you find a bug is you write a test that shows what should have happened, and then you fix the bug. If you want a new bit of functionality, you first write some tests. And all this is happening in the context, often, not always, but often in software, of kind of well-understood inputs and a well-understood goal and lots of errors that are pretty unmistakable. And the other thing that modern best practice is to have what's called a continuous integration system, which will run these tests all the time. So at very least every time a commit's made to the repository, but preferably literally just all the time. It's just running them all the time. And the advantage of this is that if you find a breakage as soon as it occurs, basically it's normally much easier to fix it because you've probably just broken it than it will be further down the line. So that's kind of the background to all of my thinking about this. And I guess, you know, the process is pretty much the same in data analysis. This might be slightly unfair, but certainly a lot of the analysis I've done over the years and a lot of the analysis I've seen is slightly less sort of organized than that idealized test-driven development process I was talking about, where, you know, we catch some data and we try and formulate the problem and we look at it and none of it makes any sense, and we try and segment it and we discover we don't even understand what the variables mean, and we have to go back and ask people, and it turns out the data's all wrong and it's inconsistent and you can't join it, and, you know, we spend ages and you know, eventually maybe we start to get somewhere and think we've got something, but we're probably running out of time by this point, so we, you know, either decide to ship it and hope it's okay, or possibly just to abandon the whole exercise. And okay, this is an exaggeration, but I don't think it's a particularly extreme exaggeration for quite a lot of what I've seen. And so I guess it's over a decade ago now, my longtime co-worker, Patrick Surrey, who's a Canadian from Toronto, from London, in fact, Canada, said, shouldn't we do, you know, we believe in test-driven development, shouldn't we do test-driven data analysis? And it was kind of immediately clear that the answer was yes. And the only problem was we had absolutely no idea what test-driven analysis would mean or would look like. So basically spent the last decade trying to fix that. And I guess the general idea that we've been working with is that we need to take the idea of test-driven development, of testing software for correctness, with the idea of testing data analysis for the meaningfulness of the analysis, for the correctness and validity of the input data and the output data, and indeed intermediate stages along the way of the data as well. And also, as far as possible, I think we have a sort of duty to do the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, and try to say not only that we'll chuck the results out and it's up to other people whether they interpret them correctly, but to do our damnedest to present results in such a way that it's hard for people to misinterpret them as well, though the frameworks can't necessarily help you with that too much. And so this is what we call test-driven data analysis. So let me explain how we put that together with reproducible research in the context of the Global Confinement Center of Excellence, and tell you a little bit about that. So GOFCO, as it's laughingly known, is a non-profit that's been established as a kind of global economic observatory to try and study the way that people and businesses earn, spend, and save, with a view to improving financial outcomes. So improving equity, improving efficiency, improving sustainability, and so forth. So the idea is there's a lot of value locked up in financial data, but it's very hard for even governments, let alone other organizations, to get at that, because it's, for very good reasons, securely held in banks and treated as highly confidential. But equally, society has an interest in having access to that data. And so if we can, just as with health data, if we can find safe ways of having safe researchers working potentially on de-identified versions of the data set, and having strong information governance around that, and good data hygiene around that, we can potentially safely operate on that without compromising anyone's privacy, but actually generating insights that are safe to share either with governments or with policymakers or with the public or whatever. And so this has been established at the University of Edinburgh in a thing called the Edinburgh Futures Institute. We're currently looking at the financial impact of COVID-19 on citizens and businesses, so not the health impact, just the financial impact. And we're in the process of passing outputs to national, regional, and local governments to help them develop policy and to assess the interventions that they're making. And so we have this data safe haven, the GOFCO data safe haven, which is this very secure research environment modeled on the Public Health Scotland safe haven, which there was an act of the Scottish Parliament that allowed health researchers to get access to anyone's health data in Scotland, again, in a very secure, information protecting, privacy protecting way with strong governance. And so this safe haven has like 4 layers of access to get in. It uses the 5 safes methodology. You have to be an approved person. You have to have an approved project. There's no external internet access when you're in the safe haven. You go in through a VPN and can only access things within the system. You can't cut and paste from your machine. You can't transfer files in and out. They have to go through the one secure route. And there's a separate, so there are researchers and there are research coordinators, and it's the job of the research coordinators to vet data when it comes in, to check it's safe, to check it's correct, then to make it available to the researchers. Then the researchers do the research, and then their outputs similarly go into an egress area where it's checked, their outputs are checked for safety and validity, well, some kinds of validity by the research coordinators before it's released. So in this context, and the claim, well, not just the claim we can make, the true statement is that we've, to date, every output that we've shared with government has been reproduced by 2 separate software systems and separate teams, and in fact validated as correct by 2 separate checking systems as well. So we're trying very hard to do the full process. So the core aspects of what we're doing are, when we get data in, we check it, and the most important thing we check it for typically is personal or identifying information. So we specify that that shouldn't be in there, but then we have to validate that. Also, obviously checking that it is the right kind of data, that there's nothing we weren't expecting, that it, not necessarily that there are no errors in it, but at least there's nothing that fundamentally undermines the integrity of the data. Then we do our analysis, which involves replicating all of the outputs or reproducing the outputs, and also these sort of TDDA type tests that I'll tell you a bit about. And then when we've got our validated outputs, we go through output disclosure control where they're vetted. We check for minimum cell sizes to protect confidentiality. We check that no personal data was allowed in at the front end. We also check at the back end that none has magically appeared in there. And we check audit trails, check data provenance and lineage and so on to make sure that the right thing's going to the right people. So it's intending to be a very comprehensive kind of mature research program. And the way that we do this is the stuff in red is all done with this TDDA methodology, and the stuff in blue, which is smaller in volume on the slide, but is a huge part of the work, is actually verifying every result, every number. So like a couple of billion numbers so far, I think, have been replicated. So let me talk a little bit. I'm assuming you're all very familiar with the reproducible research side, so I'm going to talk more about TDDA, which I think is probably less familiar to people here. So there's a Python open source library called TDDA that we maintain. You can install it in the usual way, pip install TDDA, or you can get it in source from GitHub and install it in the usual way if you're on the Python side. And it is usable outside Python as well. It uses Python, but a lot of the aspects of what it does don't particularly require to be working in Python. And it's MIT licensed. There's documentation, there's reference. It works on all the platforms and all the Pythons, so you shouldn't really be using Python 2 anymore because it's finished. And so the first part of it is all about checking data. And the way that this works is it is a two-part process. The TDDA library can take example good data, examples of what you believe is valid data, and generate constraints that characterize that data. And it will generate constraints that are true for that data automatically and spit out a JSON file that expresses those constraints. And so the JSON file looks something like this. It has a whole load of metadata. I apologize if this is hard to read, but there's a transcript with what I was supposed to say, and the slides are available as well. And so, for every field, it will have restrictions on the type and minimum and maximum values. And if it's numeric stuff, well, in fact, in either case, it will say whether nulls are allowed and whether the field has to be unique. And if it's a string field, it will either produce regular expressions that characterize the strings, or if it's categorical, it will list the values that are allowed. It can have relationships between the fields, like maybe the end of the previous period must be before the end of this period. When you're looking at periods, for example, it will list the fields that are allowed and the fields that are required and all that kind of stuff. And it's human editable. I mean, it's JSON, so it's not superhuman editable, but it is something that you can go in and mess with. And so the idea is that you generate these constraints that characterize your data, or maybe a subset of your first data set. You eyeball them and make any changes you want. So it will tend to put tight constraints on. It will say, if the biggest income you see in your data is, £1,732,844.44, it will list that as the maximum allowed value. And of course, that's not an allowed value. You either want to take that off or to set some random number like 10 million or whatever that you really would want to know if it exceeded that. But so you can edit the constraints. You can look, very importantly, for constraints that you would have expected to be there but aren't. So if, for example, you have a primary key and it doesn't put a uniqueness constraint on that, that's telling you that there's something wrong and you've got duplicates in your primary key, because otherwise it would have generated that constraint. And then you use it to verify the rest of the data, and you get out exception reports if anything's wrong, or everything just passes if it is. And you can keep using the constraints every time if you're working with data feeds, as we typically are, then every time you get new data in, you've got an opportunity to check that, potentially tweak the constraints if things have changed, or if you if you've got a bad constraint or whatever. And so we have this process where you apply the automatic discovery process, you adapt the constraints as appropriate, you validate the whole of your data with it. And then every time new data comes in, you verify that, you monitor what's going on, and you potentially work back through the process and adjust constraints as necessary. The other main part of the TDDA library is about reference testing. So I talked about testing software in the TDD in the test-driven development sense. The idea with reference tests is the same thing, and it's very much like reproducible research. The idea is that even if you don't write tests per se, what you can definitely do is keep your inputs, ideally square analysis process, so you can just run it with a single command, and keep your reference outputs, and then check over time that you keep generating the same outputs. Now, even if you make changes to the code is one of the core things. Now, one of the difficulties with doing this is that with data science, the outputs are often too complex to produce by hand. So, when I'm writing an addition function, I can compute 2 + 2 in my head and write down what the answer ought to be. It's much more difficult to put the right regression model or the right graph or whatever, to construct that by hand. So, because the output artifacts can be large, they can be complex, and they can also, and typically do, vary even when the semantic content of that output doesn't change. So it'll turn out that the output will include some random IDs or some dates or some run numbers or some version numbers or some environment information, so that even when two results are not just like close, but exactly equivalent, The artifacts themselves, the files, are not the same. And so the TDDA library provides quite a lot of support for doing comparisons that allow you to specify what variations are okay and what variations are not okay, so that you can you can write sensible tests for these things. And also that if you change, if you have a lot of tests and you either realize there was a problem with your reference results, or they change because you change the analysis that you're doing, it gives you an automatic way of regenerating the valid results when you're sure the code is okay, without having to do it all by hand. So there's a lot of useful support in there. And so the three parts of the TDDA library are this constraint generation, checking data with these constraints, if you like, unit tests for data, and then this stuff for writing comparisons that allow you to have tests for your analytical processes. So I suspect I'm going too slowly here. So what has all this reproduction done for us? I thought I'd very briefly talk about the kinds of errors we've found so far during our stuff. There's more detail in the paper if you're interested. So things we managed to screw up. Some of our analysis used rolling windows, and we managed to produce different results for customers who had missing weeks of data, because the detail of that mattered. You'll be amazed to hear there was inconsistent handling of nulls between systems and inconsistent handling of missing values between systems. We found a super weird bug in write.csv in R, where it would randomly change the precision with which it was writing halfway down an output file. No idea what's going on there. We switched away from write.csv. Numerical accuracy, big surprise. A lot of the stuff we're doing is working with money. Money always comes into the penny, but although some databases have nice exact monetary things, neither R nor Python typically has nice ways of working with money. So you either need to convert them to integers or be rounding all the time. And of course, 20p being 1/5, not being a power of 2, can't be expressed accurately in a floating point value. So errors do tend to build up. And that has lots of knock-on repercussions. It means that when you partition or bin populations, if you bin an exact financial value, it makes a difference whether you've accumulated that value and it turns out a millionth of a penny under or a millionth of a penny over, because you end up in a different bin. Probably the most serious bug we had, which was mine, was I unrolled a loop, or at least I didn't unroll a loop, but I worked through a set of 5 quintiles, and the 5 that I went through were 1, 2, 2, 4, 5. It turned out there should have been a 3 in there rather than 2 2s. So that was an actual mistake that Shan spotted. And a perennial problem is inconsistent sort ordering. If you do sorts and they don't completely resolve it, different systems will typically do that differently. A sort of variation on that is if you use mode and there turn out to be more than one value that are the mode value, different systems will resolve that different ways. If you have 2 equally high frequency or n equally high frequency values. So we ran into all of those. During the process of this, we started off with relatively condensed pipelines, so bits of code that tended to kind of take the raw data in one big process, analyze it, and then spit out a report. And over time, what we moved to was breaking that down into many more components so that we had more points at which we could check. So, we use makefiles to put the dependencies in, and we can check the results after extracting the raw data, after doing the measurements, after calculating the analytical values, before graphing and all that kind of stuff. And that was very helpful. And then at the output side, there's all the testing that we've talked about, but we also have to check that we've applied minimum cell sizes correctly, because we have rules about not producing results over small populations. We have to check that no PII data, no personal data, has magically found its way into the reports. And we have to check the audit logs to make sure that we really have verified everything we think we have, and that the data lineage is correct, that the outputs that are going to people are the right outputs. We haven't sort of crossed 2 banks stuff over and sending outputs from one bank's stuff to the other bank or anything like that. And that's what an audit trail looks like, but it's not very interesting. So closing thoughts. How am I doing? Just about there. Closing thoughts. I'll leave you with 2 thoughts. The first one is, I said for years that it was Jeremy Paxman who used to say this, a famously pugnacious interviewer, but it turns out it wasn't. It was a foreign correspondent at the Times who was asked what he thought when he was interviewing politicians. And what he said was, The thought that's going through my mind over and over again as I interview them is, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And I think data scientists need a version of this as well. And the thought that's going through my mind whenever I'm doing analysis is, how is this misleading data misleading me? Why does this result that looks obvious, why is it actually wrong? Now, Shan, my co-worker, says this is the wrong way to think about it. And it's not really the data's fault. It's always our fault, which is absolutely right. But nevertheless, we need to be constantly vigilant. And the final thought is what I call Blakesdictum. This is Blake from Glengarry Glen Ross, not William Blake. You may remember he was the super salesman, the corporate troubleshooter who came down, and his ABC dictum was always be closing. And I think what I really want the data scientist dictum to be is always be testing, but obviously that's not ABC, so we'll have to have always be checking instead, which I think is a good motto for us, a good dictum for us to have. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm sorry that was a bit rushed. It's all there in more detail in the transcript, and the slides are available. And there are loads of ways of getting in touch with us if you are interested.
Thanks, Nick. That was really interesting. We might just deal with a couple of questions just for a minute or two. We have a few more breaks today, so there's a few chances to make up the time. So if anyone has any brief questions, feel free to add it in. If you could add in the paper, that would be great. Maybe into the Slack or something at some point, Nick. That'd be.
Oh yeah, the links are there, but I can into the Slack. Yeah, I can do that.
Oh, yeah, quite right. You already have it. It reminds me a little bit of some of Rich Ioni's work with Point Blank. It's a similar sort of data ingestion checking package where they're checking the values and things as it's coming in. So that might be of interest for you checking it out. And then in the interest of replication, I would note, we can see in Nick's background, he's got this Ardbeg bottle, and Nick, we've got a perfect replication right here. So.
Have you drunk the same amount as I have?
This one might be rather empty. Does anyone have any brief questions that they wanted to ask? I think it'll be interesting to see how like RStudio and sort of competitors and things evolve over the next few years. And I think building some of this stuff in makes a lot of sense. Your idea also around making it impossible for people to fail or to do the wrong thing is something. So in statistical sciences, we're very interested in trying to stop people from abusing confidence intervals or p-values and things like that. And it sort of reminds me of some of the shifts that we're trying to make to try and stop people from making these mistakes. So very interesting work, and looking forward to seeing how it evolves and using some of it in my own. But thanks very much.
I guess from my point of view, the most obvious areas for that are poor graphical presentations. So, you know, all the stuff about truncated axes and misleading, you know, time series and all that kind of stuff. But also, I would say with the interpretation stuff, it's, you know, people think about the really subtle stuff, but it's often really gross things like, you know, you produce a value that, you know, and your system makes a prediction that it's 99.99999% or whatever, and you think, fantastic, we'll fly the aeroplane. But that was actually the probability of crashing, not the probability of having a safe flight. And it can literally be as bad as that.
Yeah, well, that's pretty bad. Yeah, no, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation.
Thanks, Rohan.
Amy, did you want to introduce Julia?
Yes, sure. I will do my best with your name as well. Okay. Julia Schulte-Klus is a